Okay. Alrighty, I think we will begin there. So, hello everyone. I'd certainly like to welcome you all to the first of our presentations for the GA 2020 virtual series. Very excited to, obviously offer this web series. So over the next 8 weeks, we'll be bringing you guest presenters from around the globe discussing topics from genetics and breeding goals and pretty much anything dairy related. So we're really looking forward to sharing this all with you, and thank you so much for coming on board and joining us. So I'd like to introduce our first guest presenter for the series, John Droppert. So John Droppert is the Senior Industry Analyst for Dairy Australia. He was raised on a dairy farm in Gippsland, and John has extensive dairy background, having previously worked in numerous roles throughout the industry. John has been part of the Trade and Strategy Group at Dairy Australia since 2012. With a focus on global dairy supply and commodity market dynamics, John provides analysis and insight for both Dairy Australia and external industry publications. John is the lead author of Dairy Australia's Situation and Outlook report, which makes him the perfect candidate to offer to inform us of the forecast for the global and Australian dairy industries for the next 10 years. So without further ado, please go ahead, John. Thank you so much for joining us, and go ahead.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks everyone for dialing in. It's definitely good to try something different, and we're all getting pretty good at this, I think. Oh, that's just jinxed myself, but I hope you've all got the the conference experience set to your liking, whether you've filled up a satchel with a whole bunch of paper or popped a few Mentos or just skipped straight to the conference dinner and a few drinks. Don't let me stop you making it work for yourself. I've been given a fairly broad brief for this conversation, which is great. It also means a high potential for self-harm in what I might say, but what I would like to say before we start is I spend a lot of the time talking about dairy markets for the here and now and the short-term outlook, and certainly still doing a lot of that. I'm going to try and focus a bit further ahead tonight, but if you want to hear more about the here and now, certainly happy to take questions tonight, but also we'll be doing a whole bunch of presentations in the weeks ahead. So, through DA or RDPs or anyone else, I'm sure you won't miss it. But like I said, we're gonna launch off a bit further ahead tonight. And having said all of that, I've kind of come right back to the here and now. And we started 2020 with a certain set of circumstances. Feed was expensive, milk was down, sentiment was rubbish, the market was looking pretty good. And then, of course, a few things have changed pretty rapidly, including the nature of this conference. We've seen COVID-19 come along and put a wrecking ball through supply and demand in dairy markets. But at the same time, we've seen a few things really dramatically turn around here on the home front, and particularly some really good rainfall that turned that fodder equation really from one where, I think the last thing I read about fodder before Christmas was that we were going to be out by April. Now we're in a situation where prices are coming down, and both for hay and grain, the outlook is much more promising. Sentiment, we'll be talking a lot more about that when the next Situation Outlook report comes out in a few weeks' time, but it has improved, and even post coronavirus or the start of coronavirus, we have done a supplementary survey to the one we normally do in February and March, and sentiment has continued to improve, which isn't totally surprising given the fact that our industry is still doing business and a lot of others aren't. But of course, also in light of the the broader challenges, it's encouraging. Milk production is still down. We're expecting a drop for this season, but now that drop is between 1% and 2%, probably quite a chance of being even less than that. Whereas if you talk to me in November or December, I'd be thinking a 4 to 6% drop. Really, since February, even if you take out the leap year, since February and through March, and we're about to release the April numbers, milk production has really started to strengthen, and we did expect a stronger second half of the season, but not quite as strong as it's been. Again, that rainfall coming into play. Now, of course, what we haven't changed since the end of last year is that we're still having a lot of conversations about policy, and if you're someone that gets excited about that, there's a lot to feast your eyes on, whether it's inquiries or debates, or the Australian Dairy Plan as well in the mix there. So plenty to talk about from a policy perspective, and that doesn't seem to change a whole lot. But on that note, with the Dairy Plan in particular, one of the activities we've been taking part in as part of setting the scene for that plan was having a look at what the industry could look like in 5 or 10 years' time. And it's a fairly loose sort of exercise by its nature. And we started it in 2018, and we put some finishing touches on it in 2019, and we had a pandemic in 2020. So these exercises are always fraught. But the idea is really to scope out the sort of growth, the scale of growth that you expect to see if we get it right as an organisation, as a group of industry bodies, and as an industry more broadly. And the real criteria for that was, what would happen if we had a profitable, confident, and a united industry. You might say they're pretty ambitious objectives. That's what they are. So if we get all those things right, we start to see some growth in milk production. And that's growth's a bit of a dirty word in some regards, but the point of all that really is that we're trying to demonstrate that we're an industry that is of value to the community, is of value to the country, and when you want to be taken seriously in a trade negotiation, and trade talks are pretty relevant right now, showing that you do deliver that value back into the community is worthwhile story. The growth itself is, it's much of a muchness. It doesn't make too much difference to any individual farmer whether the industry is growing in the short term. And in fact, it might mean more competition in some respects. It does mean more critical mass in others, so more services and the like. But it's more about the overall picture when you're trying to negotiate those bigger, that bigger slice of government attention. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but the point really is that that's the kind of scale we're looking at if things go right by 2030. And of course, the hows of that, we've got a whole dairy plan, and even that's, not the sum total of everything that's being talked about. There's a whole lot of debate on what we need. It effectively, as I look at it, comes down to profitability on farm. The whole PhD thesis in itself. Risk management, so giving farmers and processors the tools to manage risk, because risk isn't going away and volatility isn't going away. And also resource availability. So we could have a really profitable, confident and united dairy industry here in Australia, but around where I am in Gippsland, they're pouring a couple hundred acres of concrete every year on fairly good dairy land. You go out further to the McAllister, and there's horticulture moving in. Up north, of course, the issues around water availability and the total consumptive pool are not new to any of these. So that resource availability sort of stands alone, because no matter how good we are, we're not going to be able to compete with all alternative land uses. So that's the economic side. But what I'd really like to spend the most time on tonight is going a bit back to first principles. And the first place to start with that, as any university lecturer or any marketer or any economist will tell you, is start with the customer. So if we want to know where we're going as an industry, we probably want to know what our customers want. And for farmers, of course, the customer is a milk processor to an extent, but I'm talking at the whole industry level. And I reckon there's three things that the customers are after. They want cheap food, they want ethical food, and that's a doozy, because what's ethical mean? And they want differentiation, or more specifically, they're prepared to pay for differentiation. So let's walk through that. Consumers want cheap food. that's pretty simple. It's a luxury for some people. They're stingy. It's a need for a lot of people. A lot of people, are counting the pennies. And yes, they do say quite regularly that they will pay more for milk, for other products as well. They're happy to pay more, especially if it goes directly to farmers. But we know if the product's side by side on a shelf, they'll buy the cheap one, and you can see that in the chart there following fresh white milk sales over the past few years. Now, the interesting aspect of that chart is what we see in 2016 when we had the step downs and things turned pretty ugly. We did see a consumer response there, and then that was a tangible demonstration of consumers reaching into their wallets and paying more where there previously hadn't been a problem for them buying private label milk. But even so, over time, that has drifted back towards the status quo. And I have to apologise that the 2019 data isn't in that. I can assure you it's drifted much back closer to 60% market share for private label milk. So we have seen that reversion over time to the status quo. And that's likely to remain a challenge. I mean, we're not we're not a low-cost country for producing much of anything really, but so selling products on the cheap is, that means that's difficult. It's not easy to do. And then of course there's various proposals at the moment for regulation to try and, if you can't convince consumers to pay more, you can always force them to. You can take that choice away. But each of these has challenges too, because if you put a floor price in, for example, at the retail level, if you push that private label price point upwards, there'll be consumers that'll pull back from branded to private label because I think the private label product is, the price point's fine now, and you'll only push that private label price point up. If you apply a levy, for example, to all products, then you have consumers that are going to trade again from the branded back to the private label. That's only one part of the consideration, and I know there's active discussions going on at the moment about, forms of intervention that, for various reasons, including, addressing the cheapness of cheap milk. But the reality is, from a consumer point of view, they want cheap food, and we know that because they keep buying it. And given an alternative, whether that's milk from next door, or milk from interstate, or milk from another country, or another product altogether, and we'll talk about that a bit later on, they will tend to take it when it's presented in front of them. So just worth keeping in mind as we move forward. We're going to continue to have that demand from the market for cheap products. The next one's ethical, and as I said, this one's a bit of a doozy because firstly, it's entirely subjective what you mean by ethical, and secondly, whose ethics are we talking to here? And what we have seen over time is that it does tend to come increasingly from the buyers of product, be that the manufacturers or the retailers, and they're representing what they say consumers want. Now, the best theory I've come across for explaining this phenomenon that we see, and we know we see it, we've seen over the last 10 years, not just in dairy, but in beef, the no added hormones and the no sow stalls in pork, and all these little things that, that may or may not have a practical outcome from an animal welfare perspective, or may or may not be more ethical by any stretch, but they become requirements, and there's a reason why they weren't being done in the first place. It's not because farmers are trying to abuse their animals. It's because there was, the practical outcomes didn't justify the cost, but now they're required. And so the best theory I've heard for describing that is one called the intransigent minority. And the guy in the photo there that's presenting is a guy called Vance Crowe, and I'd recommend you look him up if you're interested in that sort of thing. And he likes to paraphrase a theory from another guy called Nassim Taleb, who hated him because Vance worked at Monsanto, and Nassim hated Monsanto. So I think he likes to quote him as a bit of a trolling exercise as well. But the idea of the intransigent minority is that there's a small group of people who, on a given issue, will make so much noise that everyone else will cave in, because most of us don't care about most things, and this intransigent minority make life so difficult that they end up getting their way. So the example of that, and I'll pick one that's not dairy related so I don't get myself in trouble, but the quintessential example that Vance uses is that if you've got kids and you're doing a school bake sale, because he's American, they don't know how to cook, so they go to and buy a Betty Crocker cake mix and put that together. And then you go to the bake sale and there's some parent there who, is on their organic push or their non-GMO push, and they'll see that you haven't bought the non-GMO or the organic product, and they go off the rocker at you. They scream and shout and tell you, you're poisoning their kids and just make such a fuss. But the next time you have a bake sale, you're in the supermarket, if you're someone that doesn't feel strongly about organic or GMO or whatever, you're going to think of that person, you're going to pay the extra $3, and you just, because most of the time, most of us don't want to fight. We don't want to, you don't want to fuss. There'll be some people, of course, that'll, deliberately go out of their way to, to antagonise people like that, and that's probably a good thing. But most people will, most of the time, give in, and that's how we see some of these regulations and standards and specifications tightening up over time. Is that there's a group of people that make it so difficult that it's easier to give in to them if you don't feel strongly about the issue. And these can come in all different shapes and sizes. Another form of, another trend that we're seeing in consumer land is really around this differentiation. And this one is, it's where consumers are not forced to pay more, but they're happily paying more. And again, whether they're getting more or not is up for question. But if they see or if they feel like they're getting an attribute, then they'll pay for it. So, my guilty pleasure is flavoured milk, and I'll go and buy these gimmicky flavours like cinnamon donut, without looking at all the different prices of different flavoured milks, because it's something you want to try, something you feel like you're getting. And, the per litre prices, of course, it's off the charts. Your stuff doesn't even taste that good, and it's probably not that good for you, that particular flavour, but, you go and try it because it's something different. Single serve yogurt packs, you can see what the sales have been doing over the years for those. It's not the cheapest way to buy yogurt, and it's probably not all that different to any other yogurt, but it's got some attribute. The most recent ones being, the ones that have got fit written on the front because they've put some extra protein in there and called it a fit yogurt. You're not going to be any skinnier than you were before, but you're going to feel it. Another one that's worth looking at that's outside, that's actually a direct competitor for us, is this oat milk product, and that's the picture on the left there. This product called Oatly apparently was doing a fairly mediocre trade until a couple of years ago, when they sacked the whole marketing department and hired a bunch of people and just maybe ingested a few things and told them to go crazy. And so they've just built the entire brand on marketing. It still tastes like crap. You should buy some. It tastes like crap if you have a cup of tea with it, as I did under controlled circumstances. You leave the cup on the bench and come back the next morning, it'll be cracked and peeling, the residue in the bottom, because they've put so much lime in there to try and boost the calcium level up to something half respectable. It tastes like crap, it's expensive, it feels like you're drinking concrete, but they sell a lot of it, and they're doing really well because they're convincing people that they're part of a club. They convince them that they're getting something. They're getting something tangible out of being part of this post-milk generation, as they like to call it. And the other example, of course, is sticking different labels on Coke and Nutella. Still Coke and Nutella, but people go out and buy a bit more because they feel like they're getting something. But still, with all this, I think there's a lot of uncertainties about these kinds of long-term trends or these demands that I think are going to play out and influence the shape of the dairy industry and what we're providing to consumers in the years ahead. And of course, some of them are pretty obvious. So the cheap food versus people want cheap food, but they don't necessarily like the idea of industrial agriculture, even when they know what that means. People have been buying more butter because it's natural, but at the same time, experimenting with some of these fake meat products that are coming out, which are about as far from natural as it's possible to get. That's a conflict as well. We have a pro science or a set of people that will tell us that we have to accept the view of science on climate change, but at the same time will not accept the science on genetically modified products or GM technologies, or anything like that. So there's a conflict there. And as I mentioned before, we've got a whole bunch of people who go to the supermarket and say they're willing to pay more for milk, and then walk to the cheapest product that's there and buy that. And even where there are brands on the shelf that are very clearly specifically farmer owned and operated. And then there's the big one, facts versus feelings. What's actually driving the way things go. What's actually moving product. And for us, of course, as an industry, facts are important, and good thing for the dairy industry that the facts are on our side. It's a nutritious product and it's good for you. But you can run an ad saying all those things and you can ram it down someone's throat. But if their friend Karen on the internet says that dairy milk or milk's full of pus, and these kinds of things keep getting traction despite the facts. So we know that it's not just facts; it's more than facts. And increasingly, the people that are experts in marketing are arguing that it's actually the feelings that are making the world go around. And another Vance Crowe kind of takeout is an old experiment with a glass of water. And if you've got kids and you like to experiment on them, it's one that's worth doing. All you have to do is take a glass of water. You can do it in front of them. You go to the tap, fill up the glass with water like you normally would. Sit down at the table with them, put the glass on the table, look at the glass of water, smile, look at them, and push the glass of water over to them, and see if they drink it. It's a good one if you're into that sort of thing. But they saw you pour the glass of water, they know where it comes from, but they're sure as hell going to be suspicious about that. So I want to broaden out as well to talk about some of the things that are coming out of, well, not so much left field, but the market we're in is broadening. And of course, we've got a big focus on plant-based stuff at the moment, plant-based diets, fake milk, fake meat. It was all left on the shelf a few months ago with the panic buying, but nonetheless, there's a lot of people making a lot of noise about all this stuff. And, the cynics might argue that there's a commercial reason for that. There's certainly high margin products, a lot of them. And as I mentioned, the concept of the intransigent minority for a lot of the products you see on the screen there, it takes a few ingredient choices to make, a normal product into a vegan product. And if you're going to get an extra 3% of sales for doing that, and the rest of the people aren't really going to care, you're going to go and make it vegan friendly and flog that. There's not too many people that'll stop buying Coke because it's vegan friendly or products like that. There's a good example with Cheerios in the US. They made Cheerios non-GMO. They used to be the ambiguous GMO. And the difference actually, the only difference they made was they pulled out one ingredient, and that ingredient was one of the added vitamins and minerals. So the product was actually less healthy, but it had a non-GMO sticker on it, and so they managed to boost their sales by doing that, which is interesting. But for all the talk about plant-based, it's been a slow burn. Let's be honest, the stuff tastes like crap. The supermarket sales share is still sub 10%. There's very few shoppers that only buy non-dairy product, and there's probably a better slide here from some consumer research we did. There's actually the bulk of households that buy it, or in fact, 37% of households in total will buy both. So whether they've got the problem child or whether they like to experiment, most who buy dairy alternatives will buy real milk as well. So people are pretty flexible with their beliefs sometimes. But even bigger than that, I think, is probably this one, is the non-dairy, non-plant based alternatives, and that's the real unknown. I think the one that's coming in from left field and could cause a lot of problems. We've seen it with meat. It's still in very early stages, but it's happening with dairy as well. The guys on the left of the slide there run a company called Perfect Day that you might have heard about, and their idea of a perfect day so far has been that if you can, make milk proteins in a lab from a, genetically modified yeast, make ice cream out of it, and mail it out to people with dry ice around it, and people think that's a great idea. Of course, it's a gimmick, but it's making some good points. The one really interesting thing about this ice cream is that whilst there's not a drop of milk or any cow anywhere near it, it's so similar to milk protein that they actually have to label it as contains milk. So it's vegan, but it contains milk, which has got to confuse a few people. But the fact is they can do that, and once they can scale that, which there's this again still in the very early stages, but they've got big money behind them. I think Archer Daniels Midland is involved in it. Once they can scale that, they'll be able to produce a product that is very similar to what we have at a fraction of the cost. And they won't have to deal with cows or backpackers or weather or the 2 years to get a calf into the herd, any of that sort of stuff. Now it's still got its limitations. It's of course relies on genetic modification. It's much more successful with protein than it is with dairy fat. So they can't do just anything with it. But there's talk that they can, the equivalent is producing milk for 3 cents a litre. So you get a sense, even if they're off by a factor of 10 and at 30 cents a litre, these guys could be disruptive. This sort of technology, and there's a lot of money going into it. So when we're thinking about how we position ourselves as an industry or what's in store for us as an industry, it's not necessarily the competitors across the ditch or the competitors on the supermarket shelves today, but there's some other things that are kind of coming down the pipeline as well. Now I should say, the ice cream's great. It's a great idea, mailing ice cream. It's pretty cool. I haven't tasted it because it's in the US, but they can't do just any products with it. And the reality is that a lot of people ultimately would get past the gimmick and probably not want to have that yeast ice cream necessarily. It's probably ingredients where this stuff's a real threat. So if they can produce a milk protein that can go into a baked product or a food service application, it's still a lot cheaper, and it doesn't have to have a label on the front saying yeast product, fake milk. That's probably where the real threat will be. You won't necessarily see a lot of this on the shelf. It'll go into those bulk ingredient applications where they're offering a cheaper thing. A consumer doesn't have to necessarily eyeball it, but it does take away a chunk of our dairy market, or at least compete. So that's probably the bigger threat than the mail order ice cream. However, it's not as depressing as all that. We have had dairy alternatives before. As you can see, margarine's had a bit of a rise and fall over the years. And whilst butter consumption is nowhere near where it used to be back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the naturalness of butter is coming back. The unnaturalness of margarine, as you can see, is speaking for itself, and that's really tanking. But we do know from the growth in butter consumption, which actually really continued past 2010 there. It's just a handy chart from time there, but we saw really strong growth in Australia through actually 2012 through 2014, 15. Really strong growth in butter consumption, and that's on the back of butter being a natural product. It's got 2 or 3 ingredients, and it's not that similar to plastic. So we do have a selling point. We do have a unique selling point, and so fake milk and fake ice cream doesn't need to be entirely depressing. So what's the point of all this? Yes, of course, the short-term challenges and opportunities are very real. We're dealing with a global pandemic at the moment. We're dealing with a lot of farmers that until recently were in very severe drought, and feed prices are still well up there. Of course, all those things are true. We've still got a lot of policy debates to have out, and and they have to deal with the here and now as well as the long-term future, and making money. Farmers have to make money. Everyone else has to make money. It's if you're not in business tomorrow, you're not going to be in business to see what 2030 looks like. So, you know, all of that is very relevant. As I said, you know, we do about 90 presentations a year on that, that you're welcome to come and join. But longer term, you know, we do have a big opportunity, and that's what we talk about in that part of the dairy plan, is, you know, that we are an industry that can make an economic contribution. It's a sizable economic contribution, and it's one that, you know, hasn't so far been shut down by a pandemic. So it's, you know, we're an industry worth having around. And, you know, that said, there are challenges and threats. Consumers want cheap food, and whatever they say, I believe they're going to continue to want cheap food. They will, however, pay for something that they value. They might go and buy the cheapest white milk they can, but then, you know, go out and pay for a nice cheese or a yogurt that makes them feel less fat or something like that. And then there's this kind of pressure for practice change that's coming in. That's, you know, and most farmers, if not all, have dealt with this firsthand over the years. You know, the rules that come in and the things that have to change because, you know, because someone said so, effectively. And you know, the challenge posed by the fact that there's a lot of big money back in the plant-based and the lab-grown alternatives, and there's, you know, everyone from Bill Gates downwards is chipping some money, you know, including a lot of global dairy companies are backing non-dairy alternatives, which, as a dairy farmer and as people directly linked to the dairy industry, is, you know, is a bit of a nuisance, even if it's good business for those guys. Having said that, it shouldn't be all depressing. We do produce a product that's got all the facts going for it. Demand is still growing. It's a big world out there, and you know, I think COVID is going to, you know, put the dampener on some of this economic growth that we know drives dairy consumption. So that's you know, that's no good. But ultimately, we have seen over the years dairy demand is resilient and has grown, you know, on average by about 2% a year, and 2% of 600 billion litres is still a lot of litres. So you know, structural demand growth is there, and even as some of these alternatives start to chip away at you know, at that level of demand, you know, we're not about to see things fall off a cliff. It's just, you know, these guys are going to be fighting for it too. As I said, natural is a big selling point. That's proven. That's proven facts. People want to buy a natural product. They want to buy an unadulterated product, and you know, dairy is the quintessential one of those. And we've seen the experiences of other industries. You know, we've seen this happen before. We've had margarine ourselves. We've seen wool and synthetics. You know, we're not the first people going into this sort of battle. So what about 2030? I think it's still going to be expensive to produce milk, especially in Australia. I think we'll be talking about cost of production forever and a day. You know, governments aren't going to come in and get rid of all the regulations and red tape as much as they might say they're going to. New technology, I mean, you're going to be hearing about some fantastic speakers on new technology in the next few weeks, I think. But, you know, on the other hand, we're going to have these annoying people out there trying to restrict some of that technology, and it's going to be a constant treadmill to, you know, to keep the technology ahead of the fear of technology. And, you know, the challenging thing about agricultural economics, you know, which is a little bit depressing to learn, is that, you know, returns do normalise over time. So, you know, if there's additional profits to be made, they're going to capitalise themselves in asset values anyway. So, it's always going to be challenging. There's going to be more competitors, of course, and we've talked about that at length. And then, you know, there's the bigger issue of where we position the industry as a whole. You know, do we have to fight everything, or you know, or do we end up finding our place as you know, with more of those things that consumers want to pay for, and you know, less fear of the other end of things. That's all I've got. I'm happy to take any questions in regards to that, or anything else that's on your mind. Please feel free to probably use the chat box or whatever Claire says.
Thank you so much for that, John. That's fantastic. As John said, we do have a chat box there, so please feel free to shoot through any questions that you might have whilst you're on board. I guess one to kick it off, John, from myself is just in relation to milk alternatives. I know, as you mentioned there's, some people might be surprised to only see, less than 10% of people using milk alternatives. Is that something that is, you know, I guess especially in Australia, or is it kind of a bit of a, across the board globally? Is that, that kind of below 10% average is what you would expect across the board?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, you've got your sort of divide between your Western European and North American markets, and they're actually, I don't know the specific numbers off the top of my head, but they're actually well ahead of us on alternatives. Very, especially in Western Europe, especially all these semi-socialists, they like to drink soy lattes and that. So there's increased penetration in those parts of the world. The US to some extent as well. Liquid milk consumption in the US is falling off a cliff. It's more because people are not consuming milk rather than that they're consuming a different type of it. Australia's been quite strong for dairy milk consumption. So in terms of developed countries, we've really held the plant-based monster off for better than a lot of others have. But so yeah, somewhere in the middle of the pack, I think, is probably the answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. John, I don't know if you can see in the Q&A box at the moment, we've just had a question come in that says, what is the world supply and demand looking like given what has happened in the US and Europe over the last 3 months?
Yeah, so it's been a bit of a roller coaster, really. I mean, the first thing that happened was, the setup to that was that supply was growing, in those markets in particular. So the US and Europe had both seen milk production grow or start to grow, and that had that was starting to tip markets over. Commodity prices were good, farm gate prices were good. It was the weather that had been holding people back, and that had started to turn. So we were seeing more milk. And then, you bring in a shutdown of food service markets. US school milk consumption is about 7% of their total milk. So shut the schools, with a massive drop off in demand. And so that's what caused that milk dumping that we read about. But it's sort of moved into another phase now where we're seeing things start to normalise a little bit. I think the market's still out of whack. We've still got, milk production is still growing. That, as you know, firsthand takes time to slow down, but and we haven't seen the lockdowns totally end yet. But in the US especially, there's been a real effort to clamp down on milk production, and a lot of farmers have been told by their processors, whether it's a cooperative or someone else, to cut the milk. They just said, we've got 20% too much milk. Don't send us, send us 20% less next month. And so we've had a lot of farmers cutting grain rations, culling cows, all those sorts of things. So it is getting back into balance, and in some ways it's doing better than what you might have hoped. The governments have also stepped in and forked out to buy some product as well. So I think the supply-demand balance is still very much an oversupply, but it is adjusting, and it's adjusting quickly. So it's heading in the right direction, but obviously there's a real challenge when you have something like this come in and shut down so much demand.
Absolutely. Just another question that we've had pop up is, we hear a lot of noise about the decline in the Northern Victorian dairy industry. Will there still be a dairy industry in Northern Vic in the next 10 years, and how will this affect other regions? Yeah,
well, good question again. I think if 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, I was in Northern Vic for a few things that even if you think 06, 07 and that, what it was looking like in Northern Victoria, then I didn't think there was going to be any agriculture in Northern Victoria 10 years down the track from there. The conversation about the north at the moment, speaking as a Gippslander, but nonetheless, at the dairy, you look at the whole market, it looks very much like that region is going to be more of a domestic focused region and more of a milk balancing sort of region. So a lot of milk, there's a lot of milk coming into the north at the moment. There's a lot of milk going out of the north, heading further north. So less of a seasonal, massive capacity export processing region, and more of a, making the most of those flat curves, much more flat curves that, that farmers have moved towards in terms of dealing with feed availability and the reduction in pasture availability. I think it's, it looks like it's going to be a smaller industry than what it was at its peak. I think it's going to be a much more of a locally focused industry, but I'd say there's still going to be an industry up there. The challenges are still very real, but I think there are advantages. There are advantages still up there that people continue to work with.
Just another question for you as well, John. I know we looked at milk alternatives, but has there been an increase in terms of white milk, but different varieties like A2 milk, for example, organic milks and that kind of thing, all those different ranges?
Yeah, look, over time there has. Again, consumers will pay for something different, and A2 is probably a perfect example of that. We've been arguing about the science, I think, for 15 years, but market share is growing, and organic has been arguing about for even longer. So we've seen growth, strong growth in both those categories. I think it's probably fair to say, and I think there's even a question alluding to this, and chucking goat in the mix as well, that over the past few months, they take a hit because people pull back to what they know, and they pull back to what's cheap, and so they lose some of the discretionary spend. But again, long term, people feel like that's something they want, and when they can afford to buy it, they do. So we've seen growth across all those. It's a bit of an hourglass, really, if you think about it. It's, you throw in single farm or single source brands, local brands, so Gippsland, Jersey, and others like that. Over the years, they've seen real growth up there, and then we've seen real growth down at the private label end of things down the bottom. And it's the old mainstream brands in the middle that get squeezed because they're kind of too similar to the private label, but more expensive. So people move one direction or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that it's kind of answers one of the questions that another question we've seen pop up, which is niche markets in organic and goat milk products have seen a bit of a hit over the last couple of months, and is that likely to continue? Did you want to elaborate on your answer there, John, or I guess that kind of answers
the only other thing I think I'd add there is that that's probably one of the bigger challenges facing dairy more generally in the next few months or even years, is that there's a lot of people out there that are going to be feeling pretty poor. They either are poor, or they're reading on the news every night about how poor everyone else is, and they're thinking, geez, I better not spend so much. So I think that's really going to be a challenge for that value add story.
Absolutely. Probably a similar question again is the rise in alternative milks equally linked with the rise of dairy intolerances, or is the consumption lift also consumers buying the products for other reasons like welfare and emissions?
I think the question, the bulk of people buying those products don't have. I'm not a doctor, and so it's probably unfair for me to talk to them. But my understanding of the research is the bulk of those people don't have medically diagnosed intolerances or allergies. They might have drunk something vaguely related to dairy milk and felt uncomfortable afterwards, and so they've diagnosed themselves with an intolerance, and so they've tried something new. That's what a lot of it is, or indeed they are buying it because of other reasons, be that allegations about the health or allegations about the practices in producing it. Most, or very few, as I understand it, to do with actual medical issues. Again, facts don't seem to be quite as important.
Yeah. Another question that's popped up is there a real risk that dairy could become the next barley and impose tariffs on Oz dairy? Yeah,
there is a risk of that. I suppose the one thing I've tried not to do in my presentations and especially media comments is run around talking about the risk of that, because I think it's fair to say running around saying pick me is probably a brave kind of thing to do, I think. But yeah, we do have an exposure to China, and there's a chance that'll be used against us. We've got really good commercial relationships within China and good market development relationships. And what we have seen in the past is that the trade side of things has kicked on even while the political stuff's been fighting itself out on a different level. But yeah, with barley and of course red meat, there's been the two have started to mix a bit. So there's a challenge that things could get more difficult, but he's hoping and he's working towards them not.
Absolutely. Another couple of questions and then we'll finish up. How does Australia's dairy processing sector compare to other countries? And are there technologies that would enable access to new markets or higher value? I mean, this is also, I guess, a question that we will, bring up with a few other of our upcoming speakers, but would be, certainly curious to hear your thoughts on this too, John.
Yeah, well, pending what other speakers might say. I mean, the general impression of Australia's dairy processing sector is that, on one hand, a lot of the infrastructure is quite old. Less so as more's been closed, more of the old stuff. But old infrastructure, which of course carries its issues, but also means it's fully depreciated. So that brings advantages too. It tends to be smaller scale. We're a relatively smaller producer compared to Europe, US, and New Zealand as well. So there is that. Again, the flip side of that is you can do smaller runs, you can do high specification products and stuff like that as well. So smaller and older, but again that comes with advantages. In terms of technology, I think there is technology out there, but of course, we haven't invented it here in Australia, so our competitors also have that. I guess it's a question of whether, things like, US cheese making technology, do we want to be able to make a kilo of cheese in the same day, through some of the ways that they manage to do that, or should we do it differently? Obviously companies have to make that decision, but there's a lot of technology out there if you want to invest in it, and we've got a lot of old plants too.
Yeah, absolutely. The last question I've got here is, what's the most exciting improvement you expect to see in the dairy industry in the next 10 years? E.g., is it new products for consumers, new technologies on farms, that kind of thing? Is there anything that you can that we can get excited about in these kind of uncertain and challenging times?
Yeah, I love a good bit of technology, and just based on what's happened with that in the past sort of 10 or 15 years, I find that exciting as a general concept. The one from my point of view, of course, being an analyst, is the risk management piece, and I think that is something as an industry that we do really, really badly. We've got a 1990s milk payment scheme and 2000s sort of 2010s plus corporate structure, which doesn't have a whole lot of cooperatives in it anymore. And so I think there's a real opportunity to change that. But of course, it's something that is very, very difficult to do because someone's got to go first, and someone could lose out of it. So I think, changing up the payment scheme and building in some risk management would really take a lot of the headache out of it for farmers and also for market analysts who can download the data. So self-interest is a powerful motivator too. But I think that'll be something really exciting that's within our grasp, but proving very difficult to get off the ground. Yeah,
absolutely. And probably another question that I'm sure will come up in our upcoming presentations as well. I mean, we've got a lot of our presenters that, it's not just going to be, genetic related. We've got some amazing, ag tech focused sessions and that kind of thing in terms of like collars and everything like that. There's a lot of new technologies that we can be excited about that yeah, will be released and continue to be developed over the next 10 years. Awesome. Well, we might finish it there, John. Thank you so much for jumping on board tonight and kicking off our series. Next week, we will be fortunate enough to be joined by Joel Mergler, who will be joining us from the United States, which I'm sure he'll be excited to get up for an early morning there. But John is part of the Select Size group over there, and we'll be discussing topics regarding the global genetics industry. Where is it going and what's it looking like over the next 10 years? So yeah, certainly encourage you all to join us again, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. And please yeah, get in touch with us. If you've got any further questions, I can pass them on to John, or like, share all the presentations, and yeah, look forward to seeing you all again at 8 p.m. next week, which is Australian Eastern Standard Time. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great evening.